2024 Paper 1, Section C. Let's have a look at these 25 mark questions. Let's get started with question 7, of course 25 marks here. So evaluate the microeconomic effects. Now this is something you need to pick up on. Effects questions are different to other types of questions. I have a full video detailing that. But to evaluate the microeconomic effects of increasing energy bills on the hotel industry of your choice. Now, like I always emphasize in Edexcel, especially the real world application is absolutely key, and this question is asking you a very specific area of the spec as well, an industry of your choice, and it's referring to hotel industry, it's referring to rising energy bills, and this paper's in 2024, so it's last year as of the time I'm recording this. So I'm recording this in 2025, and we had students who came to the live classes, and since we'd gone through an example which is pretty much perfect for this. The example I literally remember going through was ice cold warehouses, where due to the energy bill rise due to the Russia-Ukraine war, we saw the ice cold warehouses bills double. So when in 2022 from 520 million to then 1.1 billion in 2022 again, due to the rising energy crisis and the rising energy bills. So for this question, I'm not going to pick the hotel industry. I will still use the bits of application with which we are given in this stimulus. So it talks about how the hotel in Scarborough, the energy bills have risen ×4, and a really good bit of knowledge at the end. It says that small businesses do not have the management teams to negotiate better deals. So of course that has a really good link to the second question actually, which is about contestability, which is that barriers to entry where small firms will not survive and the large incumbent firms will survive. Therefore you can talk about maybe these rising energy bills, these energy crisis could lead to a lack of competition in the market where the large firms just survive, the firms with monopoly power survive, and the normal smaller businesses do not survive or cannot survive. Let's move on to actually answering the question. Like I said, the industry of my choice is going to be cold storage units. Very good example and very related to this question due to the rising energy bills. So now it's asking for microeconomic effects of the rising energy bills. So the first thing we need to quantify is rising energy bills. So what type of cost is this? Of course, rising energy bills, I would say, is a variable cost. Since the more energy you use, the higher your cost for energy bills will be, which aligns with the definition of variable cost, which is cost varies per output. So we've clarified it's a variable cost. So we've therefore now established that the variable costs for firms are now rising. Now, if you think about diagrams, how do we show the variable cost for firms rising? Of course, we can show that on a cost revenue diagram, or as a lot of you may know, a monopoly diagram, and which two curves shift upwards. Of course, that would be your MC and your AC curves are shifting upwards when variable costs increase. And that is going to be a very important diagram for your chain of analysis, so let's get that drawn out. So of course we have D equals AR and MR twice as steep, and then we have our AC curve, and then we have our MC curve. What is the rule with MC? MC of course intersects AC at its lowest point, and now let's draw on the profit maximization point. So where MC equals MR, then we go up from there until we hit our AR curve, go left from there. This now gives us P max, which is our price, and go down from there, which gives us Q max. Now let's just label up the box supernova profit. So what do? We go up from Q max until we hit AC, and now that is our box of supernova profit. And of course, like the question states, the rising energy bills, which of course in 2022 were due to the Russia-Ukraine war, which is again a bit of application you can use. Like I mentioned, for cold storage units, cost doubled from 560 million in 2022 to still in 2022 1.2 billion in 2022 worth of costs. So it shows the extent of the impact of these rising energy costs, since of course if you think about the nature of course storage units, they need to be on 24 hours, they're heavily relying on energy. The increase in variable costs would cause the MC and AC to shift up like this. So of course AC shifts up and MC shifts up, labeling that AC1 and MC1. Therefore, what do we do now? We need to find the new box of supernova profit. How do you do that? Where MC equals MR again, but where MC1 equals MR, which is now this point here. We go down yet again to find Q max 1, and then we have P max if we keep going up. So we have a smaller box of supernova profit. But now this of course depends on how you want to navigate your chain of analysis, since if you want to talk about in your chain of analysis these firms are making a loss, so that's a really good chain of analysis where you can talk about how when these energy prices have doubled, it means these firms are making significant losses, therefore are forced to close. Of course, what you'd have to do is just put your AC curve slightly higher. So just make sure your AC curve is above your new price. So new price is P max. If the AC curve is somewhere here, for example, if we get rid of this AC1, of course, what we do to determine the profits, we go from Q max 1 and keep going up until we hit an IR curve, which is now the price, P max 1. But now, to find the costs, we keep going until we hit our cost curve, which is now this. So now this blue box here would represent what? That would represent losses. That would be the losses the firms are making after an increase in costs. So depending on your chain of analysis, you could manipulate this diagram to show what you want it to show. So if you're going to talk about losses, you can of course shift AC up just slightly higher, so it's higher than your price. Therefore, for every unit the firm is selling, they're making a loss. Then you could mention things like short run shutdown point, which is really interesting and a really good point to mention. But yeah, there's lots of different ways you can manipulate this diagram. You can show losses, you can show they're just breaking even. You can of course show they are making profits, but then smaller profits in proportion to their profits before. So how would I actually write this in a chain of analysis? Firstly, we're talking about the rising energy bills. But before we speak about that, I just want you to introduce a diagram. Ignore MC1, AC1. Just talk about the normal diagram, the normal equilibrium the firm, this cold storage units reach. So before basically the rising energy bills, we get a price of P max and a quantity of Q max, therefore leading to this box of subnormal profit. Then introduce in 2022, with the Russia-Ukraine war, with the rising energy bills, the firms in the cold storage units saw a massive increase in costs. Then you can quote this in 2022, cost doubled, and we can see this by an increase, and that was an increase in variable costs. As you can see, MC and AC will shift up. Then you can talk about how when a firm profit maximizes, now they are making a loss. Now this is where you can link it to a very small party spec, where whenever I do live classes every single year, students always neglect this part and I teach it like they've never seen it before. So it's 3.3.4, which is referring to shutdown points. And what does that actually mean? Let's think to what AVC means, average variable cost, the cost per unit. So if your price drops below your average variable cost, we say in economics, this firm should shut down. Why? Since for every single other unit this firm sells, it's making a loss on every single unit. Thus, to minimize the losses, we want to shut down as soon as possible. And you could mention this massive increase in costs could cause firms' price to be lower than their average variable costs. Thus, smaller firms are forced to shut down as they cannot continue to make a loss. So essentially the effect, the microeconomic effect, is that small firms are forced to shut down. Whereas if you remember back to the stimulus, it says that small businesses do not have energy management teams to negotiate with the energy companies better deals. And another effect you can talk about in this paragraph or the next paragraph is on competition. As of course, these small firms, as they cannot negotiate better contracts with these energy firms, are forced to close down. Therefore, of course, that reduces the competition in the market, and these large firms who have the money to make a loss in the short run can also negotiate. They have the economies of scale. They can negotiate these contracts with these large energy firms, since these firms if you think about purchasing economy scale, they bulk buy lots of energy, therefore can negotiate lower prices, thus can maintain their stay in the market. They will not have to close down. Thus, you can also say another massive effect is a massive reduction in competition and increasing barriers to entry in the market. Which, of course, if you want to link it further on, it depends. Like I said, you can do this in two separate paragraphs. You can say this lack of competition therefore can lead to an establishment of monopoly power in the market, since all the small firms are forced out and only the firms who can make a loss, who are the large firms that can negotiate lower costs, are able to stay in the market, thus of course reducing consumer choice, worsening allocative efficiency, etc. Okay, so now we've presented quite a few points, but I'm moving on to the evaluation stage of our essay or of our paragraph. How would we evaluate this? I think a really great and a really in-depth evaluation point here would of course be, depends on the degree of dynamic efficiency. Why does that work so well? This is as if firms are extremely dynamically efficient, if they invest into research and development, they innovate, it can reduce their dependency on traditional energy. For example, them investing heavily into solar panels or alternative routes of energy, thus meaning they are not affected by external shocks like the Russia-Ukraine war, thus meaning that the rising costs don't affect them as much, the variable costs don't increase as much, and in the long run they could become independent from the external shocks of energy bills, thus meaning it will not have the negative effects like a reduction in competition. It will not force small firms out of the market. Another great evaluation point here, it depends on the PED of iStorage services, since we could mention and we could draw literally a demand curve with an inelastic PED. Why? Since we could say, however, in evaluation, it depends on the elasticity of the PED of iStorage units. Why? Since if these goods are demanded, if this service is demanded inelastically. For example, if you're a butcher, you need a cold space to store your meat, or you literally will not be able to sell it. So thus meaning the demand is fairly inelastic. So you could say, due to this inelasticity of demand, it means that consumers are forced to purchase it. Well, firms, businesses, households, they're forced to purchase this service. Thus meaning these cold storage units can significantly increase price to combat the rising costs, and due to the inelasticity of demand, there will only be a small reduction in quantity demanded, thus meaning despite the higher costs, they can basically increase price proportionally to combat those costs, meaning that the increase in costs will have no effect on profit margins, will have no effect on firms, thus meaning small firms do not have to leave the market, there will be no reduction in competition, etc. So it depends on the PED of demand for ice storage units, or whatever example you did use. And another point is, of course, with regards to the diagram, if we're looking at the variable costs, the shifting up of MC and AC, we're just assuming how much the extent to which MC and AC are increasing are shifting upwards. In reality, even if there is a doubling in the energy costs, MC and AC may only be shifting up to there, for example, thus meaning the extent, they may not be making losses, they may still be making some degree of super profits. You can 100% mention the extent, the proportion of the bills before, so the extent to which the variable costs are increasing for firms. And of course, this is a slightly tricky question, but it's a great question for revision, just to make sure you've got some industry examples, and for example, for your paper 2, you've got solid country examples, solid fact files for your paper, as this question really does emphasize, if you don't know a solid industry, you are absolutely screwed, and you essentially have no way to really answer this question or get anywhere near the top marks.